There's certain kinds of courage that don't get written about in dime novels. The kind that shows up in calico dresses and carries McGuffey readers instead of six-shooters. The kind that faces down ignorance with nothing but stubborn determination and the unshakable belief that children deserve better than what they've been given. This here's a story about what happens when civilization comes calling in the form of a Boston schoolmarm, and how sometimes it takes a lawman and a teacher working together to tame something wilder than any outlaw gang, the beast of willful ignorance that keeps good people living like animals. So lean in close, friend. The wind's got teeth tonight, and what I'm about to tell you happened when Montana Territory was still young and raw, when hope wore petticoats and justice carried a badge that was more prayer than protection. September of 1891 found Clara Bennett bouncing inside a Concord stagecoach that had seen better decades, watching the Montana landscape roll past her window like pages from a book written in stone and sky. She was 27 years old, educated at the finest schools Boston could offer, and carrying everything she owned in 2 leather trunks and a heart full of determined purpose. Clara had auburn hair pinned up proper, despite the dust and heat, spectacles that made her green eyes look larger than they were, and the kind of spine that didn't bend easy, no matter what kind of wind was blowing. She'd come west to answer an advertisement placed by the town council of Copper Falls, wanted, qualified teacher for establishment of proper school, references required, accommodations provided. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was that Copper Falls was a mining boomtown where silver had turned reasonable men into gamblers, drifters, and worse, where saloons outnumbered churches 15-1, and where the idea of book learning was about as popular as a rattlesnake at a church social. The stagecoach was making good time through Devil's Canyon when the shooting started. "Stand and deliver," came a voice that cut through the afternoon air like broken glass. The coach lurched to a halt, so sudden that Clara found herself pressed against the opposite window, her spectacles askew and her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the dust and confusion, she could see 3 men on horseback, their faces hidden behind bandanas and their intentions clear as spring water. The driver, old Pete Morrison, had his hands up and was talking fast, trying to convince the outlaws that nobody on this run was carrying anything worth killing for. "Passengers out," barked the leader, a man whose eyes were the color of dirty ice. "Slow and easy, hands where we can see 'em." Clara climbed down from the coach on shaking legs, her mind racing. She'd heard about such things, of course. Everyone back east had heard tales of western brigands and road agents, but experiencing it firsthand was like the difference between reading about lightning and standing in a thunderstorm. The outlaws made short work of the strongbox and the mail pouch. They took Pete's pocket watch and the gold fillings from a traveling drummer's smile. But when they turned their attention to Clara, standing there in her traveling dress with her chin up and her eyes flashing defiance behind those spectacles, something shifted in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. "Well, looky here," the leader said, circling his horse around her like a wolf sizing up prey. "What's a fancy Eastern lady doing in our territory?" "I'm here on business," Clara said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I'm the new school teacher for Copper Falls." The outlaws looked at each other and burst into laughter that held no humor whatsoever. "School teacher," the leader whooped. "Boys, ain't that rich? Gonna teach all them miners' brats how to read poetry and mind their manners." That's when the thundering of hoofbeats announced the arrival of Sheriff James Calloway, riding hard from the direction of town with his deputy close behind. James was 35 years old, built like a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, with dark hair showing threads of premature grey and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore his badge like it meant something, and carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd stared down death more times than he cared to count. "That's far enough," James called out, his Colt 45 steady in his hand. "Drop your weapons and step away from the passengers." What followed was the kind of gunfight that happened too fast to follow but seemed to last forever. Dust and gun smoke, the screaming of frightened horses, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off canyon walls. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the outlaws were down and the third was disappearing over the ridge like a bad memory. James holstered his weapon and immediately turned his attention to the passengers, his eyes finding Clara with the kind of relief that spoke of a man who'd seen too many innocent people hurt on his watch. "Ma'am, are you injured?" His voice was rough from shouting orders, but gentle as Sunday morning when he spoke to her. "No, Sheriff. Thank you." Clara adjusted her spectacles and straightened her shoulders. "Though I believe my introduction to Montana territory has been rather more eventful than anticipated." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of James's mouth. "Yes, ma'am, I expect it has." He turned to Pete Morrison, who was checking his horses for injuries. "Pete, that coach going to make it to town?" "She'll roll, Sheriff. Might not be the smoothest ride, but she'll get us there." James nodded, then looked back at Clara. In her dust-covered traveling dress, with her hair coming loose from its pins and her spectacles slightly crooked, she still carried herself like a woman who'd never learned the meaning of defeat. There was something about her, a quality that reminded him of his late wife Martha, who'd possessed the same kind of quiet strength that could weather any storm. "Miss Bennett, Clara Bennett." "Miss Bennett, I'll escort you into town personally. Make sure you arrive safely." He paused, studying her with those storm-grey eyes. "Though I should warn you, Copper Falls ain't exactly Boston. You might find the accommodations less than what you're accustomed to." Clara looked at this man who'd risked his life to save strangers, this lawman who spoke to her with respect despite her disheveled appearance, and felt something stir in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with recognition. "Sheriff Calloway, I didn't come west expecting comfort. I came expecting to build something worthwhile, and I've never yet met a challenge that couldn't be overcome with sufficient determination." James touched the brim of his hat. "No, ma'am, I don't expect you have." Copper Falls turned out to be everything Clara had been warned about, and worse. The main street was a ribbon of mud and horse droppings, flanked by hastily constructed buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up by men in a hurry to get back to their digging. The Silver Strike Saloon dominated one end of town, its doors never closed, and its windows glowing with lamplight at all hours. The other end boasted a general store, a barber shop that doubled as a surgery, and a small church that seemed to huddle between the larger buildings like a child trying not to be noticed. The schoolhouse, when Clara finally laid eyes on it, was nothing more than a single room with a leaking roof, broken windows, and a floor that had seen better decades. But it had 4 walls and a door that could be barred, and Clara Bennett had worked with less. Sheriff Calloway helped her unload her trunks at the boarding house run by Mrs. O'Malley, a widow from County Cork who'd followed the gold rush west and stayed to make an honest living, feeding miners and mending their clothes. "You sure about this, Miss Bennett?" James asked as they stood outside the ramshackle schoolhouse. "These miners, they're not bad men, most of them, but they're not exactly fond of book learning. They see education as something that might make their children too good for honest labor." Clara pushed her spectacles up her nose and looked at the building that would become her battlefield. "Sheriff, I've taught children in Boston tenements where rats outnumbered books 10 to 1. I've dealt with parents who thought education was a luxury they couldn't afford, and children who'd rather be working in factories than sitting in classrooms. This," she gestured at the schoolhouse, "is just another kind of challenge." What Clara hadn't anticipated was the organized resistance that greeted her attempts to open the school. It started with broken windows, not accidents but deliberate acts of vandalism that happened in the dark of night. Then came the threatening note slipped under her door, written in crude handwriting that warned her to go back where you came from and leave decent folk alone. But Clara Bennett hadn't come 2,000 miles to be intimidated by men who couldn't spell the words they used to threaten her. She spent her days repairing the schoolhouse with her own hands, replacing broken glass and scrubbing years of neglect from the walls. She ordered supplies from Denver, books and slates, maps and chalk, everything needed to build a proper classroom. and slowly, carefully, she began to win over the children. It started with Tommy O'Brien, a red-headed boy of 8 whose father worked the night shift at the Silver Strike mine. Tommy would linger outside the schoolhouse while Clara worked, watching her with the kind of curiosity that all healthy children possess but many never get to satisfy. "What you doing, miss?" he finally asked one afternoon. "Building a school, Tommy, a place where children can learn to read and write and figure numbers. Pa says reading's for folks who can't do real work." Clara set down her hammer and looked at the boy seriously. "Tommy, can you tell me what 2 + 3 equals?" The boy screwed up his face in concentration. "5. Very good. Now can you tell me what your father earns in a week, and how much of that goes for food and rent and clothes?" Tommy shook his head. If he could figure those numbers for himself, instead of trusting someone else to do it for him, do you think he might be able to keep more of his hard-earned money? The boy's eyes widened with understanding. Within a week, Tommy was inside the schoolhouse, learning his letters and practicing his numbers. Within a month, he'd brought 3 other children with him. By October, Clara had 12 regular students and a classroom that was beginning to look like what she'd envisioned. But not everyone in Copper Falls was pleased with the school teacher's success. Silas Grange owned the largest mine in the territory and employed half the men in town. He also owned the Silver Strike Saloon, the company store, and most of the ramshackle housing where his workers lived. Education, in Silas's view, was a threat to the established order. It gave people ideas above their station, made them question authority, and worst of all, it might inspire them to seek better opportunities elsewhere. Sheriff James Calloway had been watching the situation develop with the kind of attention a man pays to storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He'd found himself taking his evening patrols past the schoolhouse more often than strictly necessary, telling himself it was just good law enforcement to keep an eye on potential trouble spots. But if he was honest, and James tried to be honest with himself, even when it was uncomfortable, he was drawn to Clara Bennett in ways that had nothing to do with his duties as a lawman. There was something about her determination, her refusal to be intimidated, her genuine love for the children she was teaching. She reminded him of everything he'd lost when Martha died, and everything he'd stopped hoping he might find again. The crisis came on a cold November morning when Clara arrived at the schoolhouse to find 3 of Silas Grange's men waiting for her. "Miss Bennett," said their leader, a man named Jake Morrissey, who handled Grange's less savory business dealings. "Mr. Grange would like a word with you." Clara adjusted her spectacles and looked at the 3 men blocking her path to the schoolhouse. "Then Mr. Grange is welcome to call on me during proper visiting hours, like a gentleman." Morrissey's smile was thin as winter ice. "I'm afraid he insists on seeing you now, Miss Bennett, and I'm afraid we can't take no for an answer." What happened next would be talked about in Copper Falls for years to come. Clara Bennett, all of 5 feet 4 inches and maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, looked those 3 hard cases in the eye and said words that would have made her Boston finishing school teachers faint dead away. "Mr. Morrissey, you and your associates will remove yourselves from school property immediately, or I'll have Sheriff Calloway arrest the lot of you for trespassing and intimidating a public servant." Morrissey laughed. "Sheriff ain't here, Miss Bennett, and even if he was, there's 3 of us and 1 of him." That's when James Calloway's voice cut across the morning air like a blade. "Actually, there's 3 of you and 1 of me, but I've got a Winchester and a deputy on the way. Seems like fair odds to me." The 3 men turned to see the sheriff standing in the shadow of the schoolhouse, his rifle pointed in their general direction and his badge catching the early sunlight. "Sheriff," Morrissey said, his voice losing some of its confidence, "we're just having a conversation with the schoolmarm here. Nothing that concerns the law." "Any conversation that requires 3 grown men to intimidate 1 woman concerns me plenty," James replied. "I suggest you gentlemen find somewhere else to conduct your business." After Grange's men skulked away, James and Clara stood together outside the schoolhouse, both aware that lines had been drawn and choices would have to be made. "This isn't over," James said quietly. "Grange won't let this go. He sees your school as a threat to his control over this town." Clara nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Then we'd better make sure the school succeeds, Sheriff, because if it fails, it won't just be my defeat. It'll be defeat for every child in this town who deserves a chance at something better." James looked at this remarkable woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles to fight a battle most people wouldn't even understand, and realized that somewhere between her arrival and this moment, his feelings had moved far beyond professional respect. "Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I want you to know that whatever comes next, you won't face it alone." The kidnapping happened on a Friday evening in late November, when the first snow was beginning to dust the peaks, and Clara was staying late to prepare lessons for the following week. She was alone in the schoolhouse, grading arithmetic papers by lamplight, when 3 masked men burst through the door. "Don't make a sound, schoolmarm," growled a voice she recognized as belonging to Jake Morrissey. "You're coming with us." But Clara Bennett hadn't survived Boston tenements and Montana outlaws by being easily intimidated. As they grabbed her arms, she managed to knock over the lamp, plunging the room into darkness and giving her a moment to act. She might not carry a gun, but she carried something just as powerful, a mind that worked fast under pressure. They dragged her to an abandoned mining shack up in the hills, where Silas Grange was waiting with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Miss Bennett," he said, settling into a camp chair like he was holding court, "I hope my men weren't too rough with you, but you see, we need to have a conversation about your future in Copper Falls." Clara sat up straighter in the chair where they'd tied her, her spectacles crooked, but her spirit unbroken. "Mr. Grange, I don't believe we have anything to discuss." "Oh, but we do. You see, your little school is causing problems, giving people ideas, making children think they're too good for honest work in the mines. I can't allow that to continue." "And what do you propose to do about it?" Grange leaned forward. "You're going to close the school voluntarily. Tell the town council you've decided to return east. In exchange, I'll let you leave Copper Falls alive." Clara looked around the shack, noting the single door, the boarded windows, the lamp burning on a crude table. Her mind was working, calculating angles and possibilities. "Mr. Grange, you're making a mistake. Sheriff Calloway will come looking for me." "I'm counting on it." Grange smiled. "By the time he figures out where you are, you'll be gone and he'll be dead. 2 problems solved at once." But Grange had underestimated both the schoolteacher and the sheriff. While her captors argued about their next move, Clara had been working on the ropes that bound her wrists, using a technique she'd learned from reading dime novels, a fact that would have amazed her proper Boston relatives. When she finally freed herself, she didn't try to escape immediately. Instead, she did something that demonstrated exactly why education was so dangerous to men like Silas Grange. She used her knowledge. Clara knew that the abandoned mine shafts in these hills were connected by a network of tunnels that honeycombed the mountainside. She knew that sound traveled in strange ways through rock and timber, and she knew that Sheriff James Calloway was smart enough to track his quarry to these hills if she could just give him something to follow. When the time was right, Clara created a diversion by kicking over the lamp, setting fire to some old newspapers scattered on the floor. In the confusion that followed, she slipped out of the shack and began making noise, not random noise, but a pattern that any lawman worth his badge would recognize. 3 short sounds, 3 long, 3 short, the universal distress signal. James heard that signal from half a mile away and followed it like a beacon through the darkness. He found the burning shack with Grange's men in chaos, and Clara Bennett emerging from the smoke like an avenging angel in calico. The gunfight that followed was brief but decisive. When the dust settled, Jake Morrissey was dead. Silas Grange was in custody, and Clara Bennett had proven that sometimes the pen really is mightier than the sword, especially when wielded by someone smart enough to use both brain and courage. Long pause, letting the moment settle like dust after a storm. 6 months later, James Calloway stood in front of the little church at the end of Main Street, wearing his best suit and trying not to fidget with his collar. Clara walked down the aisle, wearing her mother's wedding dress, which she'd had shipped from Boston along with a trunk full of new books for the school. The ceremony was attended by half the town, including most of Clara's students and their families. Even some of the miners who'd initially opposed the school were there, having learned that education didn't make their children too proud to work, it made them smart enough to work better. In her vows, Clara promised to love James in sickness and health, in prosperity and hardship, and to stand beside him as he brought law and order to their growing community. James promised to protect and cherish her, to support her work with the children, and to never again underestimate the power of a determined woman with a good education and a noble cause. Their marriage became the cornerstone of Copper Falls' transformation from a rough mining camp to a proper town. Clara's school produced the first generation of local children who could read and write and figure numbers, who went on to become merchants and doctors and teachers themselves. James's fair but firm enforcement of the law made Copper Falls a place where decent people could build lives and raise families. Together, they proved that civilization wasn't something that just happened. It was something that had to be built, one lesson at a time, one law at a time, one act of courage at a time. When Clara passed at the age of 81, her funeral was attended by 3 generations of students whose lives she'd changed. The school that bore her name was the finest in the territory, and her husband of 54 years stood beside her grave with their children and grandchildren around him, reading the words she'd chosen for her marker. She taught them to read the world, and in reading to change it. Final pause, like embers settling in dying firelight. Now, I've told you this story not because it's the most exciting tale I know, though watching a Boston schoolmarm outwit kidnappers surely has its moments, but because it reminds us that some battles are won not with guns and glory, but with books and determination, and the unshakable belief that every child deserves a chance to rise above their circumstances. Sometimes civilization comes dressed in fancy clothes and carrying letters of introduction, but more often it comes wearing calico and spectacles, carrying nothing but knowledge and the courage to share it with anyone willing to learn. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the right teacher meets the right lawman in the right place at the right time, they can build something that lasts longer than gold mines and stronger than any fortress. They can build hope. The West is full of stories about men who carved their names in history with lead and steel. But this one's about a woman who carved hers with chalk and determination, and the man who loved her enough to help her do it. Trust me on that. I've seen what education can build, and it's a sight worth more than all the silver in Montana.